I'm just going to get right into this. My goal here is to give you some sense of how big what we're doing is here and how unique it is to Nu Skin and how profound it is in terms of the benefits to people. Okay? And like Christine said, none of this is so you don't need to talk about any of this when you talk to people. But once you know what we really have here in our hands, you're going to want to share it with everyone. Okay? And that's what we're doing. And everyone's saying yes. Especially now with Vitality. Everybody wants Vitality and needs it. So I'll just go on with this here. What I'm going to go over is basic genetics and epigenetics. Scientific experiments some simple experiments that really hit home in terms of showing these points. I'm going to go over the age lock algorithm. And that's the system by which Nu Skin is able to discover these youth genes and also affect them and reset them to youth. I'm going to go over the exclusivity of Nu Skin science, which really is because of this age lock algorithm that no one else can do. And finally, I'll give you a little bit on LifePak Nano and Vitality and why they're such remarkable products, and as well as transformations, but right now we're just focusing on these two, okay? So, a very simple picture. This is one way that DNA can be schematized. It's a double helix. What's been thought to date, or to recent past, is that DNA is everything. The DNA defines everything about you. It defines your characteristics. That is true to some level. But there's actually more to the picture, and that's why we're able to do what we do in Nu Skin. Basically, genetics are the alphabet of life. There's a code in DNA that reads out to make proteins. That is the basic nuts and bolts of life, okay? The letters of the DNA carry the sequence, the information to code for protein. And I'm calling that a blueprint. So the DNA is like a blueprint for all of your body's proteins, okay? And here's kind of a schematic to show you. If that was a blueprint of a human brain, the DNA would be the information holder of that blueprint. All right? And that's just a visual way to see it because I'm really going to drive this point home. So every cell you have in your body has the same DNA. Okay? And that holds true except for something like a mature red blood cell, which doesn't have DNA. But basically, every cell in your body has the identical DNA code, okay, that holds the same DNA. But you see how different they look. This is a nerve cell, some white blood cells. That's a platelet, actually. There's a red blood cell. But the concept here is look at how different all those cells look. But their DNA is identical. And even that red blood cell had DNA when it was less mature, and as it grew, it kicked it out. But the concept is every gene is not expressed in every cell, even though all the genes are present in every cell. So there's many opportunities for a gene to be turned off or on based on, and we'll find out, that's more about the environmental influence, okay? So you'll see, cellular expression can be altered because, and I'm going to show several examples of this, but these cells all carry the same DNA, but they look dramatically different, and that's what we're going to talk about. Now, there's something called epigenetics, and we're going to call that the grammar of life. Epi means above. Epi is control of the gene expression above the level of the DNA. You see, the DNA is the blueprint. And I'm going to show you that the DNA holds the information, but it doesn't hold the information of what information is read. That's an environmental thing, okay? And an example of epigenetics is if you have a book and it has all the words and sentences, and I gave the same book to everyone in this room, okay? The book is the DNA, that's the blueprint. Everyone in the room would have a different interpretation of the same book. That's more like epigenetics, okay? It's how the DNA is interpreted. And that's how you make different cell types and have different cellular reactions to the environment, okay? So here's one example of this. In World War II, there was a horrible famine. It's called the Dutch Hunger Winter. And we lost 30,000 people in that. What was learned from that experience is that prenatal exposure to famine caused low birth weight, diabetes, obesity, coronary heart disease, breast cancers, other cancers. That was seen to come out of this. But what's more powerful in terms of what we're talking about is that the next generation of children was still affected by the famine their grandparents went through. That's epigenetics. So the babies of the children of the people that went through the famine also had low birth weight. And what they find with populations is it can take generations to recover from a famine because of this kind of effect. It's not just the people that went through it, it's their children, but it's also the children of those children, okay? So you're seeing right here how the grandmothers ate when they were carrying the mothers affects the epigenetics at least 2 generations later. And Time magazine had an article in 2010 you've probably seen. It's called Why Your DNA Isn't Your Destiny. And what they did was they looked at a population that they had records on through several generations, okay? And they looked at the boys, so I'm talking about young boys, not men that are having babies, but children. Those children went through either a famine type, an under-eating winter, or a gorging one. And they looked at their children and their children's children. And what they found was that the boys that went through less eating, their grandchildren would live up to 10 or 20 years longer than the children who ate a lot of food and gorged. Their grandchildren lived 10 to 20 years less. That's a dramatic result. The data suggest a single winter of overeating as a youngster could initiate a biological chain of events that would lead one's grandchildren to die decades earlier than their peers did. And it worked in the other way too. The kids that went through famine conditions, up to 20 years longer their grandchildren lived. We're not talking about their children, their grandchildren. So there's something being imprinted in that DNA that's being handed down. And that alone is a huge statement, and that's what's going to allow us to do what we're doing in New Skin. Here's the scientist that authored this work. That's his son and his grandson. What I'm telling you is when this man is a child, he's determining if his grandchild will live 10 to 20 years longer based on how he eats. So how you're eating affects generations later, what you put in your body. But it's because of epigenetics, it's because there is information happening that your cells are responding environmentally to that's being transmitted for generations. They're called epigenetic marks. Through environmental factors, we're talking diet, stress, prenatal nutrition. These things can make an imprint on the genes that will affect generations later. So, human cells have roughly 120,000 proteins, okay? And those are all the structure of the cell, all the functions of the cell. And for instance, like if this room was a cell, everything you see is made out of protein in a cell. All of its lighting, the lights, the speaker, everything, all the moving parts in any of these things are proteins, make up the gears. It's all proteins. Enzymes are proteins that catalyze reactions, that allow chemical reactions to happen in the cell. So there's 120,000 of those roughly in a cell. So the Human Genome Project, which you've probably all heard about, was completed in 2003, where all of the DNA was sequenced. The actual letter code of all of the human chromosomes was sequenced, so they know the order. What they proposed was that because there's 120,000 proteins, they'd find 120,000 genes. A one-to-one correlation. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes. We have 46 chromosomes as a human. What was actually found was 25,000 genes. So right away, there's a discrepancy in that one-to-one paradigm. It's not that one gene codes for one protein. There has to be a way that 20,000 genes, 25,000, can make 120,000 proteins. And that's where gene expression comes in. And that's how you do it. Little example here. Rather simplified graphic, but if this were representing the DNA double helix, so there's actually two wires in there. The helix is running two. This is like a sleeve of protein around the DNA. So when you see pictures of chromosomes, they're actually about half DNA, half protein. The protein is very important in the DNA. The DNA is kind of encased, and this is very simplified, but I was just wanting to give something graphic. In order to get to that gene, there has to be a signal that these proteins allow this gene to be expressed. So the genes are not just sitting there as a free-for-all to be expressed. There's a very tight control system because it's obviously critical to the cell. And this is kind of the concept. You have to unsleeve the gene for the right protein machinery to get at it to make that gene into a protein, okay? Come on. So what's determining the gene expression is actually the environment of the cell. It's perceiving its environment, and then it uses its 25,000 genes to make those 120,000 proteins. And there's a series of events that allow that number of genes to actually produce so many proteins. There was another paper written called Metaphors and the Role of Genes in Development. There's a top biologist named N.H. Niehaut. In 1990 he wrote this. And he wrote an amazing statement from his work. When a gene product is needed, a signal from its environment, not an emergent property of the gene itself, activates expression of that gene. That is a huge statement. That is a very different statement than the genes determine everything, which is very widely believed still, but has been a very strong paradigm. A signal from its environment activates expression of that gene. The cell is interacting with its environment and getting signals to know which of those genes to express. And I'll show you a few experiments. Whoa.
At the bottom again.
Thank you. In other words, genes cannot turn themselves on and off. And that's a big statement right there. They don't self-activate. Genes are selected in response to the environment, the perception of the environment. This is why, as we go on, I'm going to show you why we can do what we do in Nu Skin. Because the cells genuinely respond to their environment, and that tells them which genes to use. And that can be youth genes. At the level of a human being now, so you look at us, we represent 50 to 70, 75 trillion cells. We're a massive community of cells, and they're grouped into organs, and the nervous system's perceiving the outside world, giving information to the inside world of the organs, and it's a way, an evolutionary way that cells came together in a community because it's more efficient. Each job got specialized, but as a human, it's our perception of the world that is really our belief systems within us that are determining how we perceive our environment and how we then use our DNA in response to that environment. It's how we perceive the world, though. You see that? It's not how the world necessarily is, how we perceive it. Because you can put 5 people in a line in the same environment. They're going to all perceive it differently. And they're all going to respond differently in how their genes are expressed because people have different pasts and different memories and different experiences, okay? So basically our beliefs are selecting our genes and our behavior. And here's another graphic example. This would be like the DNA, the blueprint of a house, the blueprint of a human body, okay? That's not what makes the house, though. The environment has to come and read that blueprint. The people have to come, read the blueprint. They have to bring the materials to follow the information there. Okay? The DNA is simply a